So our first presenter today is Dr. Kristy Love from the Family History Agency. And Kristy's presented fascinating DNA stories to us again before, and we're going to hear another today.
This talk is called Annie and the Brickwall. It's an extended version of a 7-minute talk that I gave to Talking Family History last year. So I hope you don't mind, but this tale requires a preamble before I get to the DNA. For those members of Talking Family History, the preamble is the portion that you've seen. So I'd like to introduce Annie O'Connor. She is my great-great-grandmother. You can see the path of my ancestry, starting with me in the bottom corner before I decided to stop straightening my hair, up through my mum, Maureen, my grandfather, Norman Parfitt, his mother, Lily Mae Parfitt, who we do not have a picture for, through to my great-great-grandmother, Margaret O'Connor, Annie's older sister. I know quite a bit about Annie as I'm slowly writing a book about her. Like my great-great-grandmother, Margaret, Annie was criminalised by poverty, and this is Annie's Long Bay prison record. And here are many of the newspaper reports about her. So Annie died in 1966 at 21 Phillip Street, Alexandria. Her next door neighbour, William Barnes Cockburn, was the informant. I researched this Cockburn family. It turned out they had a number of children born in the 1940s. The thought struck me, could I find someone who knew Annie? In 2019, I discovered there was a documentary called We Live Here. It was about the Housing Commission towers in Waterloo. I wondered whether one of the residents perhaps knew Annie, so I contacted Claire Lewis, the director of the documentary. She gave me the lovely suggestion that I join the Memories of Alexandria, Redfern and Waterloo Facebook page. Here is my 2019 post to that page. The responses that I had were overwhelming. I found the names of nearly everyone who lived on Phillip Street during the 1950s and 60s. I learned that Annie lived with Emily Maud O'Neill, who was formerly married to a man called Howard, and her maiden name was Frances. I also found that Emily's grandchildren, the O'Neill grandchildren, were cousins of their Cockburn neighbours. But unfortunately, I didn't find anyone who knew Annie. Flash forward 2.5 years. In June 2021, I posed another question on the same Facebook page. This time I was researching the Dungunese community of Alexandria, Waterloo and Redfern. Annie O'Connor had married a man from Dungun, China in 1915. I'd come to suspect that my Chinese great-grandfather may have been one of her associates. I had lots of lovely replies about this post that I did on the Facebook page, primarily from people reminiscing about their childhood friends, but none of those childhood friends were from the region that I was interested in. And then I spotted this, a post from someone with the surname Cockburn, who had most likely lived in Alexandria. Remember these key pieces of information? The informant, William Barnes Cockburn, living in 23 Phillip Street, Alexandria, next door to Annie. So I had to ask. Sure enough, I'd hit the jackpot. The Reg Cockburn, who had posted about his friend Billy Yee, was Annie's neighbour, the very person that I was looking for. Reg was in the ambulance service, and as a 20-year-old, actually attended Annie on the day she collapsed and passed away in 1966. It turned out that Reg and his family were very close friends with Annie and often visited her and her partner Pop while he was growing up. Reg was able to tell me many wonderful stories about Annie, including this saying of hers. I often wonder what she would make of me with my strong interest in the past. Then, on the 9th of June, 2021, Reg sent me something else. It was a photo of Annie and her partner, a man only known to Reg as Pop. The only photo frame I have that is the right size for the photo makes a feature of a great big brick wall that Annie and Pop standing next to, which amuses me to no end. So now I'd found Annie, I had a new brick wall. Who was Pop? Reg didn't know Pop's name, so he asked a cousin who had lived with Annie and his maternal grandmother, Emily Maud O'Neill, formerly Hal. The O'Neill cousin told Reg that Pop was in fact his biological grandfather. He did not know until this point in time. Although, he said it did make sense to him. He realised, having called this man Pop all his life. But given that Pop was Annie's long-term de facto husband, I then considered that made Reg my step-cousin. We were both really pleased about this idea and have since become very close friends. Reg's O'Neill cousin, however, did not know Pop's name. There was only one way to find out. So here comes the DNA. Reg received his ancestry results on the 2nd of February this year. He has kindly given me permission to use his name in this talk and to discuss this case. I have anonymised all other people who were born more recently than 1922. So I used the Leeds method on Reg's results. I had already built a tree for his maternal grandmother's group, the Francis line, and his paternal grandparents on the Barnes line. So it was relatively easy to determine the matches that corresponded to these groups. So the remaining group is this one. These are the best matches for that group. Of the top 8 matches, unfortunately, only 4 had trees. You can see I've marked the ones with trees with a tick. So the first one, while it has a tree of 3 people in it, those people are all private. The unlinked tree also looks like a useful tree. So you can see that the highest useful match is only 163 centimorgans. So if I look at that match, according to DNA Painter, and depending on the match's age, they could possibly descend from Pop himself. So we've got Pop, Reg's grandfather up here, Reg's mum here, and here's Reg. Or they could share a more distant, most recent common ancestor as far back as one of Reg's 4th great-grandparents. However, I could rule out some of these potential relationships. I can rule out the half great-great niece or nephew, given that the match was only to one parent. And given Reg's age and the date that Ancestry started DNA testing, it's highly unlikely that that his match would be more than 3 generations older than him. I'd also say it's highly unlikely that the match was 2 generations older than him, but I'm not discounting anything at this stage. So the next thing that I did was I looked at the available trees. Can anyone see a commonality between these 3 trees? I'll give you a moment to look at it. And now I can't see the chat, so if you are commenting in the chat, if you can see the common name, I'm not going to be able to see it. So if you can't already see it, the common name in all of these trees is the surname Patterson. So I then needed to figure out how these Pattersons were all related to each other. And more importantly, how were they related to Reg? I worked on linking up the trees. So I came up with a simplified version of those trees that I added into What Are the Odds? So in this version, what I've done, because James C. Patterson had a large number of children, I have represented them by either being a full child or a half child. I'd also have a full child here and a half sibling over here. So we can see that the matches to this full child over here are quite small. It turned out that placing Reg's 372 centimorgan no tree match was actually the crucial piece of the puzzle in figuring out who Pop was. That match had used their married name as their ancestry username. So when I built out my quick and dirty tree, I found that when I built it downwards, I found a woman with the surname Wilson, and I'm using an anonymized surname here. I'm using her mother's maiden name. But I found that she had married somebody with the same surname used by the match. So bingo, I was able to then place her into this tree without seeing her tree. Along with some of the other matches that I then placed, I could see that it looked like Pop was most likely one of the sons of James Colgan Patterson, who was also a full sibling to Jane Mary Patterson. So we can see that the strongest hypothesis is hypothesis 10, and it is rather larger than the hypothesis given to a grandchild of a Patterson half sibling here. So that 163 centimorgan match that I mentioned, it turned out that I managed to solve the case without even linking them into the tree. So here's the next bit. This is the list of James Colgan Patterson's children. I eliminated those who were born, who died prior to 1925, as that was the year that Reg's mum was born. So in this list, who would you start with? So my next step was to try and find who was in the right place at the right time. So would you start with a person who was the oldest child or youngest child? In my instance, I decided to start with this person here, Samuel Colgan Patterson. The reason being, I thought that his middle name would be helpful, and the fact that his middle name was uncommon, I thought that might make him easier to find than the other siblings. And if I could find him in the electoral roll, I thought that I might also find his other relatives living with him. So here we go. Here's the electoral roll. I've got some dates from 1903 to 1937. In 1931, I found that he was living in Waterloo. So this looked rather promising. Then it gets better. In 1934 to 1935, I find Samuel Colgan Patterson at 21 Phillip Street. Do you remember this address? This is the address that Annie ends up living at later on. It's also the address where Emily Maud O'Neill, formerly known as Hal, née Francis, was living. So there we have Samuel and Emily Howe together. And we can also see that, that Ernest Howe, Emily's husband, is living elsewhere. So Emily in case I need to remind you, is Reg's grandmother. However, this doesn't prove that Samuel is Pop. We need more evidence. What I do know is that Pop and Annie lived together when Reg was a child in the 1950s. So, what do we have here? 1954 Waterloo. Bingo. We find the couple together in Douglas Street, Waterloo. Then I had 2 more pieces of evidence that sealed the case. Reg told me that Pop also had a daughter called Mary. Now I'm using a pseudonym here because she may still be alive. She had a partner called Robert, also a pseudonym, and that the 2 of them lived near Annie and Pop. I found a Mary Patterson who married a David Robert Williams in Redfern. The electoral rolls confirmed that they lived nearby. Mary then married another man. By building out the Patterson trees even further, I found that the 210 centimorgan no tree match is a descendant of Mary and her second husband. Case solved. So I'm able to give a name to Pop. He was known as Samuel Colgan Patterson. Thank you.